Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Granados, Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. And on today's show, we have none other than Venezuelanalysis writer Ricardo Vaz, member of the staff. Ricardo, as always, it's good to have you here. Welcome to the show. It's been a couple of weeks, maybe a little bit more, but happy to have you again.
Hey, Jose Luis, always great to be here. Always fun to catch up on the latest. And it has been maybe more than a couple of weeks, but somehow it feels like we're stuck in this loop where we have to talk about Trump and everything he does and everything it implies.
Yeah, I know.
So
And
yeah,
I
looking
wish
forward
we
to it.
had the opportunity to talk about other things, but it sometimes feels like that's the thing we should be talking about. So we'll have to respond to the moment, and hopefully the moment evolves to gives us more positive things to talk about, because unfortunately we have a lot of bad stuff to talk about today. We're going to be focusing on the issue of migration policy in the United States, how it affects Venezuela, the consequence on Venezuelan migrants who are now at the center of this whole operation targeting migration in the side of the United States and beyond. And there's a couple of layers to that we're going to get into today. I want to start by doing a quick recap of some of the stories that we've been covering when it comes to this story of migration, the crackdown on migrants inside of the United States. And of course, this is going back now to the end of January, but nonetheless worth bringing up here, which is the end of TPS for migrants in the United States. So for those of you who don't know, TPS, it's a bit of a curious system that they have in the United States. It eventually emerged as a result of natural disasters where people were just basically unable to return to these countries and therefore were granted, as the name says, temporary protection status. And this was actually one of the protocols used in the case of Venezuelan migrants who had arrived in large numbers as a result of U.S. foreign policy that has actually driven so many people out of Venezuela and led to this migration phenomenon that we're seeing right now throughout the region of Venezuelans finding themselves with no choice but to leave. And of course, that does respond to U.S. foreign policy. We'll get to that in a minute. But, so we saw very large amounts of Venezuelan migrants arriving in the United States, particularly in the Trump administration, the Biden administration, which largely kept a lot of what Trump had imposed during his first term in place. And this has been pretty devastating news for the Venezuelan community inside of the United States. It was always a bit of a precarious situation, but I feel like it was a really easy target for the Trump administration, for the new Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, to basically kind of do away with them. So what we saw was Mayorkas, before leaving office as part of the Biden White House, grants an extension and says, these two groups, because there's two authorizations at play here, they have the full 18-month extension, and that way that they felt a kind of sense of, if not temporary, but some kind of security in terms of their migrant status in the United States. And the new Homeland Security Secretary comes in and says, no, my hands were tied by the previous administration. I have the authority to revoke that extension, and therefore the original timeline that is set to play out is the one that's going to play out. So, as it stands right now, this is potentially 600,000 Venezuelan immigrants to the United States who are under the temporary protective status, who could very much face deportation as soon as the TPS that they currently enjoy expires. I'll get to the figures in a minute exactly when each group does expire, but it's kind of this sword that's hanging over their heads. And, it plays into this narrative that the Trump administration has been putting forward when it comes to migration in general and Venezuelans in particular, that, they have to take action to get rid of them, to get them out as fast as possible, allows them to boast of large numbers and say, look, we're following through on our commitments to engage in a mass deportation plan, expelling as much people as quickly as we possibly can. And of course, this is interesting because I think it ends up interacting a lot with U.S. domestic policy because, believe it or not, Ricardo, people like Maria Elvira Salazar is opposed to this. She is one of the biggest hawks when it comes to Venezuela policy of pushing for regime change. Oh, the dictatorship in Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera. We're very familiar with her language. now actually at odds with the Trump administration because she represents Florida. And there's a lot of Venezuelans in Florida who obviously want to have this protection extended. And a number of other right-wing, far-right Republican lawmakers are actually opposed to this designation. So again, we've talked about it in other episodes now, but we see how these kind of end up clashing with each other. And I wanted to now throw it over to you, Ricardo, about that panorama, how you see the impact of this mass deportation plan on Venezuelan migrants via the TPS, but also how this is actually creating some kind of disagreements within the Trump coalition because of the importance of the Venezuelan population. I saw a headline. The headline was basically Venezuelans are going to learn how much political muscle they really have in the next coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I mean, Trump does expose the contradictions quite fast. And I mean, this reminds me a bit of the argument of, people who lobby for a war and think the bombs only kill the bad people. So here you had this very paradoxical or absurd scenario of Venezuelan migrants themselves lobbying for a crackdown on migration because they think there's going to be some kind of distinction between, the good migrants and the bad migrants, and then it comes and it's really a one size fits all, and it means trouble. So that's why you have even these hawkish figures like Maria Elvira Salazar saying that they oppose TPS, and they do some kind of contortionism where they say, oh, I support Trump on some things, but when I disagree, I'm going to say it. It's a very delicate balance and very hard to strike. But yeah, I mean, as you were saying, the Trump administration wasted no time in pushing its migrant crackdown. I think it's clear why Venezuelans are being scapegoated. I think on one hand, it speaks to the never-ending regime change plans and the animosity. But also, I mean, if you compare it to Cuba and Nicaragua, this is the largest group of migrants right now. So in that sense, it kind of helps. It helped during the campaign fuel this narrative that criminals. I mean, it's like you can play any recording of Trump and it's going to say the same thing. Criminals are coming through the border and destroying our country and so on. So now you have them all in this kind of limbo, which in a way, while they're not deported, and I think it's impractical and logistically impossible to deport that amount of people, but it leaves them much more exposed. That means that they can be even further exploited while they're in the US and trying to make a living. So it's really this Trump policy of going hard after everyone at the same time. But now, the question is, what does it mean beyond that? I mean, it goes back to the campaign that, we knew migrants were going to be a priority. But I mean, we see it with everything that Trump is doing. It almost seems like he first tries to go too far or threaten to go too far so that then, everyone is on the back foot. And then he thinks I mean, that's kind of his whole MO, that he's always negotiating and getting the best deal. Actually, just a few days ago, maybe yesterday, we're recording this on February the 21st. There was a lawsuit challenging the revoking of the TPS. A group of Venezuelans with some immigrant legal groups challenged that in court, saying that the Trump administration did not present valid grounds to revoke the measure, that even their own discourse is kind of contradictory. I don't think that's going to bear any fruits because, I mean, basically it's an executive decision and they don't have to justify it anyway, but it shows maybe that they want to buy some time. But in the end, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that the Trump administration is mostly about appearances, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to execute the largest deportation in history, but it certainly needs to create that narrative. We saw it with the wall. I mean, the Trump administration constructed less wall mileage than both Obama and before him and Biden after him. Yet still, he's the one who's associated with the border and the heavy-handed policies to deter migration. So it really is, and that's what makes it perhaps more unpredictable, that it doesn't have to correlate necessarily with reality and with the figures, but when the Trump administration decides that it has enough of a PR victory to change its focus elsewhere.
So I wanted to just share that information that I alluded to earlier. So with the 2021 designation of TPS, that means that they're facing an expiry date of their legal status on September 10th, 2025. And the more recent group, 2023, theirs will actually oddly enough, expire first on April 2nd, 2025. And I think you're right. I think a lot of this is very much driven by appearances. Ultimately, Cristino may even extend it as a result of the pressures domestically from lawmakers or a constituency that is seen as important, like the Venezuelans in Florida. But I wanted to pick up on something you said around this about being appearances, because we're actually in this really unfortunate situation where even the protection of basic dignity, of basic human rights, is now the floor. So, whereas opposed that was something that I think was generally understood, even if within the bipartisan mess that is United States politics, that okay, people are going to be expelled, or they're going to be deported, or they're going to choose to be repatriated, but they'll get on a plane and they'll go home and then to live another day. What we're seeing instead is this really grotesque effort by the Trump administration to really send a message through its visuals of sending migrants in chains in really difficult conditions. And there's two things that can speak to this. One is, of course, we talked about this in a different show around the conflict with Colombia, which basically boiled down to Petro refusing to accept military planes with migrants in these horrible conditions, leading to this tit for tat between the two. Ultimately, they both, found a common agreement. But in the case of Venezuela, what we've seen is, of course, this effort by the government. Certainly that's the way that they're trying to transmit their response to the situation, of wanting to ensure the dignity of migrants, of using the state-owned airline Conviasa to go and pick them up, be it directly from the United States, which is actually pretty interesting. It's like the first US-Venezuela flight in many, many years, or an arrangement with Honduras, which we'll share in a second. But I wanted to walk through this article here, written by our colleague Andreina Chavez, talking about the actual experience of it, of sending the plane to Fort Bliss, picking them up, and actually having the Venezuelan Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello actually personally receive many of the migrants. We saw these scenes of people actually arriving rather jubilant, which is kind of almost somewhat difficult to reconcile with the fact that being deported is a very emotionally, physically taxing thing that is done. But I suspect there's probably a bit of relief of being back in your homeland, back close to where family and others are. So, but really this really quite difficult, horrendous kind of situation where that is the floor, where just basically ensuring human dignity is what's happening. And I wanted to ask you, Ricardo, what does this respond to? On the one hand, you talked about this being about appearances, but is there something more to this? What do you think there's a reason why the Trump administration is so insistent on this, and why the Venezuelan government in kind is so insistent on putting forward this kind of counter narrative to say that, yes, these are people being deported, but we want to make sure that they have at least a dignified welcome when they get back to Venezuela.
Yeah, I'll pick up on where you last left it. I think it's a battle of narratives. But on the one hand, it does speak to Venezuela being in a better bargaining position, believe it or not, than the governments of Colombia and Brazil, who only had these kind of wars, communique wars, whereas here in Venezuela, Trump's envoy came personally, and it was a very high-profile meeting that we reported on. So there is a battle of narratives where the Trump administration is, criminalizing migration, and this has also the purpose of, trying to stop people from going there. I mean, here in the case of Venezuelans, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but there were people who went to talk to migration officers and present their case after crossing the border. That didn't stop them from being rounded up and sent to Guantánamo. But we'll get to that in a second. There is a battle of narratives between the US narrative of, saying these are all criminals, the worst of the worst, which is really a deplorable language. And on the other hand, the Venezuelan government, rightfully so, in my opinion, trying to combat that and saying, these are just people who, quote unquote, committed the crime of going to the US. And we are welcoming them back. We insist that they travel on in dignified conditions. That also speaks to sending our own airplanes to pick them up, and it also on this side fuels the the narrative, which has a lot of backing, that the situation has improved, so now there are conditions for people to start returning. So it also, I mean, everyone is speaking to their own constituency, but I think the Venezuelan government is really making an effort, and also speaks to Diosdado Cabello being in the airport to greet them personally and so on, to challenge this idea that they're all criminals and ensure that they get treated with dignity. I mean, Diosdado was there at the airport yesterday again, and he always has a great sentence for the cameras, and he said, those who have accounts to settle will with justice will go to court, and the others will go home. But they're not all criminals. But it again takes responsibility for the situation, and incorporating them in this return to the homeland plan, even though it's stretching it a little bit because this was originally a voluntary program. Of course, there are no diplomatic relations with the US, so people could not really request, even if they wanted to, could not really request to return to Venezuela. But I mean, in terms of PR, the Venezuelan government is certainly doing its part to challenge this idea that Venezuelan migration is driven by crime and so on. I mean, we know that's not the case. I mean, these are people who, I mean, there is some element of this American dream extended idea that things are going to be great in the US. But I mean, at the heart of it, people were looking for better economic conditions, given the situation here in the country, which has improved, remains very difficult, but it's very much correlated and very much caused by US policy itself. So it kind of goes full circle.
And I do think it's important that states push back on this narrative, that it not be allowed to become mainstream as they clearly are attempting to do. Right? First, we saw the case of Colombia. We see the case here of Venezuela, the case of Mexico as well, also pushing back around this narrative that, all migrants are criminals, that they're all illegals, that horrible dehumanization that they try to engage in, and actually always centering the migrant, their humanity, their human rights, which unfortunately doesn't happen enough. But I think another part of this is what we've seen around Guantánamo. So we've seen.
Before
Yeah,
we get to Guantánamo,
sure.
let me ask you something. You were talking about this imaging of showing them in very poor conditions and being handcuffed and so on. Do you think this is the Bukelization of Crackdown and Law and Order and so on? Because Bukele is one who's always paid a lot of attention to this kind of generalized criminalization. Even there was even an agreement when Rubio visited Central America to kind of outsource prisoners to El Salvador. So I wonder if you think there's Bukele is setting the trend here.
I think he certainly shifted the debate. He made mass incarceration something that could be done in a way that makes you popular. And I think that there is a certain affinity between what we saw play out, what we see playing out in El Salvador with what's happening in the United States with Donald Trump. I mean, I think part of the reason Bukele is so quick to cozy up to Trump is that he understands that a lot of what he's doing lies outside of the Salvadorian constitution. And eventually that's going to catch up to him, right? You can only be a despot like him for so long. But he understands as well that, sure, he has a lot of domestic support, unfortunately, but he needs the United States on his side, because if the winds change, if the political winds shift, and it's not seen as acceptable to be dealing with somebody who openly promotes mass incarceration, this dehumanizing kinds of language as well, then he knows that he would be exposed because he loses that pillar of support. So I think that's part of what's driving Bukele, but it's also very convenient. The United States is definitely in a different period now in terms of how it's trying to determine its place in the world. And I do think that, it's less interested in sort of being the center of the conversation in the international community, and it's easier to kind of offshore these kinds of problems, to say we're going to send the migrants to El Salvador, let them deal with it. There was talk about some of these migrants who are accused or have been convicted of being involved in organized crime to El Salvador, even U.S. nationals to be sent there, and so It's like the exporting of this problem to a different country so that they can wash their hands away of it, right? To say that problem is now over there. They're not subject to the even limited protections that the U.S. Constitution offers because they're no longer in U.S. territory. And it does solve a lot of problems for them, which I think brings me to my next point around Guantanamo. There is a reason why they decided to use it, although it looks like there's been a backtrack on that, and we'll have to make sense of that as the situation develops. But we saw at first the expansion, deliberately so, of the facilities in Guantanamo Bay, the territory that is illegally occupied by the United States on Cuban soil, in order to house migrants. Now, I should be clear about this. This actually has been a long-standing policy since basically the 90s, since the Clinton years, to house migrants in Guantanamo. It actually started with mostly Haitians as a means of preventing them from being able to ever reach the United States and be able to petition for asylum. Mostly people who were caught at seas from the Caribbean, from numerous countries, trying to make it to the United States, ended up in Guantanamo and then deported back to their countries of origin or elsewhere. And in the case of Biden, we actually saw towards the end of his term a contract be issued. This was reporting done by Dropsite News, saying that they were thinking about expanding it again in order to, again, be able to hold more migrants. But the difference with Trump, which I do think is important to point out, is that we're talking about migrants who were detained already inside the United States being shipped to Guantanamo Bay. And I think this obeys some of the logic that we were just unpacking previously around dehumanization, around this effort to deliberately marginalize them in the public discourse to make it seem like these are criminals. And I think this is also, I wanted to ask you, tied to this emphasis around the Tren de Aragua. So we saw the executive order on Trump's day one saying that Tren de Aragua is going to be a foreign terrorist organization together with ultimately 6 Mexican organized crime groups. And I thought we could start with, first, what is Tren de Aragua? This term, this group is mentioned a lot. You know, you read any stories like, oh, it started in Venezuelan prisons, but then grew in size. Who are they really? And what do you make of this effort to try to tie all Venezuelan migrants, all Venezuelans in the United States to this organized crime group, to this gang that comes from Venezuelan prisons?
There was an ironic text on social media. I think it was here one of the Venezuelan alternative, those websites that do fake news, and they were saying, all Venezuelans belong to Tren de Aragua until proven otherwise. So basically, the origin is disputed, but the most accepted version is that Tren de Aragua began with these syndicates around the construction of a train line in Aragua state. These syndicates who extract bribes and so on. And then it expanded by essentially establishing its roots inside Venezuelan prisons, and particularly Tocoron, which was notoriously one of the largest prisons here in Venezuela. And last year or a couple of years ago, the government actually made a significant intervention in Tocoron and other major prisons to tackle organized crime that was operating from the inside. But by then, Tren de Aragua is one of those things that becomes a myth. And so it's in everyone's benefit to say that, Tren de Aragua is operating in Peru or Tren de Aragua is operating in Colombia. Although, if it is a crime organization and there is money to be made, whether that's from trafficking minerals or, human trafficking or charging to cross people, from through the Darien Gap and so on, of course they're going to seize those opportunities. But it became kind of a myth where it's in the benefit of local law enforcement to say, oh, we have this big threat, we need more money. Same with the US. Basically every crime, even petty crime, committed by Venezuelans, I don't know, they stole phones in New York, then it becomes like a part of Tren de Aragua, and then they start connecting all these dots and saying, oh, this is a major crime syndicate operating inside the US, and there are others who go even further and say, oh, this is being orchestrated by Maduro. Of course, there's no evidence of it, and actually the government has made a point of saying, we dismantled this group here in Venezuela, and we are happy to cooperate and exchange information to help tackle it otherwise. But this is one of those cases where it's useful to generate this threat because it fuels this narrative you're mentioning of just criminalizing all migrants. And here, when we hear Guantánamo, it sends shivers, right? We recall these cases of people called Gul Rahman, the John Smith of Afghanistan, just being randomly grabbed in the middle of the night and taken to Guantánamo for 15 years without any rights and without any prospects. So that's the kind of thing we immediately recall, as well as all the torture that took place. And this was one of the things that was brought up. I mean, these Venezuelan migrants, basically their relatives lost touch with them, and then they saw them on social media. They saw them being boarded on a plane to Guantanamo, or even arriving.
There's a term for that in Latin America when the state does that. When the state does that, it's called a forced disappearance.
Exactly.
But it doesn't apply because the U.S. is doing it. You're literally taking them to a different territory on what seems almost like CIA-style rendition flights. It's a forced disappearance. Until you actually know what they are disappeared. They're not detained. It's wild the way that some of those terms don't apply when it's the U.S. doing it.
Wasn't it Nixon who said that, if the U.S. president does it, then it's not a crime?
Yeah, something like that.
It's the same logic, and maybe we'll go back to this at some point. But I think it goes to show that the second Trump administration, even more so than the first, is certainly much more naked in terms of its policy. It doesn't really care about appearances. It doesn't really care about the Constitution. It's just going to, do what it has to do, and then everybody else has to fall in line. And the Guantanamo case is also emblematic of that. I mean, and as well as people being mistaken or taken for Tren de Aragua because they have Jordan tattoos. I mean, the Jordan brand was incredibly popular, like basketball here in Venezuela in the 90s and early 2000s. So it's just some generalized profiling to criminalize this entire group because it fuels this narrative that has already been established. Now, to another point that you mentioned, and here maybe I'll throw it back to you. Why singling out the Venezuelans? Why only, as far as we know, only Venezuelans were sent to Guantanamo, and now last night, if you understand correctly, they were all flown back to Venezuela. So we'll see if this was just a one-off episode or if it's going to be repeated. But I think, I mean, here we are speculating, but I think it shows the U.S. kind of hedging its bet. So on one hand, it engaged directly with Maduro to ensure that they could do these deportations. But also there's this narrative, Tren de Aragua, crime is on the loose and the Venezuelan government is behind it. And there were rumblings that never really took off, but we need to pay attention to them, of also adding Venezuela to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. So if the US wants to create this idea that, the Tren de Aragua is a terrorist organization, never mind the evidence or the actual reach that they have. And if now they can say that the Venezuelan government is directly behind it, then they will, if they need to, and if they actually feel it's necessary, be able to create a case that Venezuela is sponsoring terrorism inside the United States. And that can be used to exert even more collective punishment against Venezuela. I don't think it's on the cards right now. I don't think anyone has connected these dots. But I think it's there, so I'm wondering if this is a useful hot take or if I'm reading too much into it.
No, I don't think you are at all. I think you're onto something there. Why do I say that? Because as soon as the actual order comes out, sort of the secondary order to the executive order around foreign terrorist organizations, what does the U.S. shadow president Elon Musk tweet out? That means they're eligible for drone strikes. So we're talking about giving legal cover to extraterritorial, illegal military actions against perceived enemies or even governments that are uncomfortable for the United States. So in the case of Mexico and the organized crime groups here that have designated, has been specifically around this concern that I think is legitimate around there being these military interventions without the authorization of the Mexican government, these so-called drone strikes, when need only look at the legacy of Obama's drone strike program, of how many innocent civilians were killed as a result. But it's easy for them to kind of put this out there. But to return to Venezuela, I think you're onto something to say, well, these or gangs, this Tren de Aragua is sponsored by the Venezuelan government. Therefore, there are also, as a result, legitimate targets under the framework of U.S. anti-terror law. And, to go back to that, I think quite specifically, in the fallout of 9/11, 2001 in the United States, a whole series of laws that we warned at the time were going to severely curtail civil liberties and open up the possibility for hostile actions against other states. These laws were passed, and they're very powerful. Basically, according to U.S. interpretation, of course, it doesn't respect international law, but according to the U.S. interpretation of its own constitution, these laws give them cover to engage in these direct interventions with states with which they're not at war. So we already know there's so much of the kind of covert actions and the color revolutions that they pursued here in Venezuela. Obviously, with the discussion we had previously around USA, it seems like they're shifting, and I think you're right. This is kind of more like the true face of the far right MAGA movement in the United States to do this, to say, well, Tenderagua, it's a terrorist organization, and you're the sponsors of terrorism in Venezuela, so, a drone strike on your facilities or on individuals is legitimate. That sounds like a conspiracy, but one need only look at U.S. history to understand what that means. I wanted to also come back to this piece here because we have this line at the bottom about some of the comments that the family members of those who had been taken to Guantánamo had said. The relatives claimed that the detainees had traveled to the U.S. in search of better living conditions to provide for their families and had no association with illegal activities, even showing evidence that they had no criminal priors. And I think, again, we have to really emphasize this. Most people that leave Venezuela are doing it for economic reasons. The economy was severely punished. Yes, as we've mentioned, there is a modest recovery. We have an infographic. I'll throw it up at the end of the program that talks about some of these fluctuations in terms of the economy. But of course, there are people at the bottom who pay the price of these U.S. imperialist interventions in Venezuela and have led to these conditions and forcing them. And the other thing I wanted to mention when it comes to this is, of course, the fact that bringing up this older podcast that we had, episode 12, Truth and Myths on Venezuelan Migration, there our guest, I think, made a really important, Daimar Martes from the human rights organization Sures, talking about how we have to remember that there was a deliberate strategy of actually the call effect or the pull effect of actually trying to compel migrants to leave Venezuela as part of the regime change strategy. It was all this narrative of like, look, it's such a failed state. Oh, they're creating ripple effects throughout the region. This is why we have to, in some cases, people even talked about an armed intervention activating the TIAR, the mutual, the reciprocity measures in terms of regional issues to stop the threat of Venezuela and everything that it was causing in the region. It all obeyed that logic at the time, the maximum pressure campaign around making it so that the conditions were so unbearable and that the proof of that was the migration. We had Sebastián Piñera literally inviting Venezuelans to come, like, oh, we're ready for you. We'll make things good for you. And now we see this boomerang. So now we have Trump and the maximum pressure applying this as part of the strategy, really trying to compel people to leave as part of that plan. Then we had Biden that largely left everything pretty much in place, changing almost things only on the edges. And then Trump 2, which is basically now dealing with the own consequences of his own actions when it comes to Venezuelan migration. And so I wanted to throw it over to you on that point, Ricardo, of this boomerang effect that we're seeing of kind of the maybe not unforeseen, but these consequences of decisions that were made several years in the past, now bringing us to the situation now. And of course, who's paying the price? Venezuelan working class migrants who are either being returned or facing this threat of expulsion.
Yeah, I think boomerang is quite the proper term for it, although it's not unforeseen, as you were saying. I mean, everyone knew this was going to happen. And there's also kind of a two-layered phenomenon, because originally migration is headed towards the Latin American countries, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, even Chile and Argentina. And then, of course, it's not like these economies were bustling. And so eventually, and also with the pandemic, many of them return and then leave again. And because, they don't have any prospects here in South America, what's left? And they just engage in this grueling march to the north to try and get into the United States as a kind of last resort. So here, indeed, it's like the chickens coming, the migrant chickens coming home to roost. Of course, with the difference that they all the lowest of the pile, the Venezuelan working class ends up paying the price twice. I mean, first they are collectively punished, and I wouldn't say forced to leave, but it's not like they have a lot of alternatives, and then they get there and that they get criminalized, and in the best case scenario left in this kind of limbo. In the worst case scenario, rounded up, chained, and sent back to Venezuela. Fortunately, with the Venezuelan government ensuring some minimum dignity conditions. But it shows how imperialism, and U.S. imperialism in particular, will always refuse to learn its lessons. It will not accept that the migration, which isn't really an issue to the proportion where it's presented, it's more of a scapegoat, but it will not accept that it's a consequence of its own actions, right? It will just plow forward and create a new narrative. Now it's criminals are getting here, or even the Venezuelan government is sending criminals over here. So it will just it will continue. I mean, I think it would be foolish to think that there's going to be a major change in Venezuela, in the Venezuela foreign policy. Even though, and actually, we should take credit for this. We said it on the record that they were not going to recognize a parallel government, and I think so far we've been right, and there are no signs that that's going to happen because, again, it's a much more naked foreign policy approach that does not require those kinds of hindrances. So the sanctions policy is going to stay intact for all it looks, and I think it would be foolish to think that because Trump is a bit all over the place, that somehow his interests and your interests are going to be aligned. So what we're looking for, and there were even explicit threats of hardening sanctions policy by revoking the Chevron license, but now with a further threat of criminalizing migration. So sending to Guantánamo is also a message for people to see. You might be caught with the Jordan tattoo, and then next thing you know, you'll be in Guantánamo. So it's really like a crackdown on both fronts. Sanctions are going to remain tight. So I mean, we can also wonder what the Venezuelan government discussed with Special Envoy Granol when he was here. But on the other hand, we're going to ramp up the crackdown to ensure that the fallout of our own policies, the U.S. policies, are not going to end up here on our border, on our doorstep.
So you mentioned Granol, and I wanted to talk about this on the program as well. So far, it kind of looks like mostly it was the U.S. who got it. They got some of the nationals returned. They got these deportation agreements, which was a major issue for Trump. Being aware that one of the major population groups is indeed Venezuelans, that he wasn't going to be able to throw them all into Mexico or send them all to El Salvador or wherever else that he's signed these agreements with countries. And so, you had this face-to-face, open, not backdoor meeting with his special envoy. We can see the picture here on the screen of Maduro with Granel in the presidential palace. And so, not in a sense, that is a win. But what other things did Venezuela really get out of this? Because so far, it does, if I'm being honest, still look a bit one-sided.
Yeah, I mean, we have to wait. I mean, I think the date on the calendar is April 28th, if I'm not mistaken. That's when the Chevron license expires. And so far, it has always automatically renewed every 6 months. But the question is what's going to happen now. My speculation, because I mean, many people have made the mistake of underestimating the Maduro government over the years, whether that's expecting it to fall imminently or to just make any kind of blunder. But it has shown itself in many different arenas to be quite shrewd in its maneuvering. And so I would think that it at least got some assurances that the sanctions policy is going to stay the same in the short to medium term future. It's kind of
So not get
keeping
worse.
the status quo, not get worse at least. I think that's at least the basic thing that the Maduro government would have gotten out of this. But of course, until April 28th and the renewal of the Chevron license, it's still a mystery. Actually, I wrote an article about a week ago outlining the different options, foreign policy options for the Trump administration. Spoiler, they're all bad. There's no, I mean, there's more hope than expectation that somehow there's going to be a loosening of sanctions policy. I don't think that's on the cards. I think that would be very hard for the hardliners like Rubio to sell. But also, hardening the sanctions policy right now would also be counterproductive because they need the cooperation of the Maduro government to continue with this deportations policy. So I think the agreement from trying to read the tea leaves is that at least the status quo is going to maintain for the upcoming months, maybe 6 months, I don't know. But going back to what we were saying in the beginning, it's a lot about appearances. So there might be a point where the Trump administration can say, oh, we've solved the migration issue, and so now we can go back to ramping up. I mean, regime change is always on the cards, but we can go back to ramping up regime change against Venezuela and withdrawing the Chevron license, even adding Venezuela to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. That was actually a possibility that I didn't include in the article, or even harder enforcement of sanctions. I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done if the US wants to ramp up the economic pressure, or even worse. We were mentioning this kind of blanket permission, or permission, quote unquote, to start striking militarily against these manufactured targets like Tren de Aragua, foreign terrorist organization. So I mean, all of this is to show that, or to say rather, that we need to remain vigilant. And of course, with the Trump administration, not everything is as it seems, and there's a lot of noise all the time that gives us a lot to talk about and a lot to unpack. But things can change very quickly.
So I wanted to put also on the screen here this recent analysis from one of our columnists, Clodovaldo Hernandez, where he talks about precisely on the recent events in the Trump 2 era and their impact, and of course the Venezuelan opposition, right? So we talked about how they're not going down this path of the parallel government, but we know the opposition largely is guided by what U.S. imperialism wants them to do. They don't act really as independent political actors. So I invite you to check out this article. It's actually not too long, which is a little bit unusual for Clodovaldo. He usually has a lot to say, so give it a quick read as well. And of course, invite everybody to check out the analysis part of the website. We have a piece here that you co-authored, responding to this, which I think this is what you're referring to. Some of the possibly potential things that could play out when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. That is on our analysis page. I wanted to finally close this episode with a brief conversation around some of the more recent imagery. Of course, we saw this case. The Trump administration abruptly clears out migrants it sent to Guantánamo. All of these Venezuelan migrants that had sent there initially, for whatever reason, maybe the propaganda exercise of sending them out was enough for them, and now they can kind of go back to the other methods of indirect flights or whatever it is. But we're also seeing this kind of thing, which is really worrisome. We have this interview here from the Home Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. Really aggressive language. Leave now or face deportation without the ability to return. Sending a warning to criminal illegal aliens. We see again that kind of a deliberate effort to confuse. We will find you and deport you. These images of people being detained. They run this ad at the very beginning of it where you can actually see the kind of imagery they're using. Just this deliberate effort to confuse. And then I think there was really another quite qualitatively worse thing that happened. There's that image I was wearing. Arrested and other, faces of migrants changing. Is this allegedly ASMR video of migrants being chained up. No faces can be seen on this. They're not even worthy of having their faces shown, because it's not because they're trying to protect their identities. I'm certain of that. That's not what they're doing here. We saw this comment here from The Intercept. Trump and Musk delight in the sounds of human suffering with sick ASMR video. I saw another one from The Nation expressing a similar sentiment. This really does feel like we crossed the line on that one, right into the kind of fascist, openly fascist imagery. You mentioned earlier Bukele, and he's kind of, this sounds like an echo of that, right? How they kind of feed each other. He has these images of alleged gang members, tattoos on their faces, being marched down the halls of those mega prisons that he's built. And then you have this in the US. I wanted to make some time here for you to give your assessment in terms of, am I right to feel like this is a bit of a line that has been crossed now into openly fascist kind of imagery and language?
Yeah, I think that's the nice, appropriate way to put it. It's like fascism unleashed. And, with everything that comes with it, this complete dehumanization of entire groups, the complete disregard for, even by US standards, minimum concern for human rights and dignity. And it's kind of the shock and awe policy of the Trump administration. Just to make a small comment, we will go back to this at some point. How the hardline Venezuelan opposition is one of the early losers of the Trump administration, and we only need to look at how he's treating Zelensky to realize how little concern they have. They know that these people depend on them, and they are not going to, like they did in the first time, where they hosted Guaido and took him to the White House and so on. They're not going to bother with those niceties anymore. Just they're going to lay down the line, and everyone has to follow it. So it really is a brave new world in the worst sense of the word, of just pushing forward these MAGA interests, running over anyone who stands in the way, even if they don't know that they're standing in the way, to impose the narratives, and having people like Musk around who just exponentiates everything. So I think that we're barely a month into the second Trump administration, and it already shows where it's headed. And I think on that note, I think it would be an opportunity to strike back by fostering again regional unity. There was, when there was this this Twitter spat with Colombia on a Sunday afternoon, there was like an emergency CELAC summit convened to address this. But then, because Colombia and the US found a solution, then it was called off. But I think it would be an opportunity. Certainly, the stakes are there for Latin American governments to put together a united front and actually realize that the US is coming for all of them. Whether it's the easy way or the hard way, whether it's now or in 6 months. So they shouldn't have any illusions that maybe we can reason with Trump at some point, or we'll just catch him on a day where he says something that's useful. No, I mean this is what's going on, and not just the mistreatment of the most vulnerable people who are immigrants, but also laying down this possibility of randomly drone striking in foreign countries. So the threats are very real, and I think they should be taken seriously too.
And that's exactly the point I wanted to finish on. There is a personal empathy as someone who spent his whole life migrating, living in different countries all the time, only being able to recently return to my homeland in the last 10 years. Part of my empathy is driven by that. But the other one is also because, if that's what they're willing to do to the most vulnerable, they're also willing to do it to you. They just start there because it's easier to start there. But the mission is always to expand it, to be more fascist towards everybody. And so, I think about Guyana, for example. Look at what happened to Zelensky, right? Do you really want to be on that side? Do you really think that when it comes down to it, they're going to stick up for you? Because history shows that it doesn't. And for people inside of the United States, maybe you have been somewhat convinced by this so-called narrative of an invasion and, the border is open and all this kind of stuff. What they're doing to them, they would eventually do to you if they found it necessary. That's the logic of fascists, and why we should pay attention when they tell us who they are, when they release videos like this that are atrocious. It's not just about being offended for the moment, but it's actually about understanding what it's really telling us. Before we go, I wanted to finally just share here, let's see if I can pull it up on the screen, the infographic I had mentioned briefly at the beginning, just some of the different contexts that we have here on the Venezuelanalysis website, Free Fall and Rebound, taking stock of the Venezuelan economy, which breaks down the recent trends here. Real quick, scrolling down, look at it with detail. As always, trying to bring you different information in different mediums. Of course, the podcast here, but also news, analysis, interviews on the Venezuelanalysis website. Be sure to check us out, read directly on the site, follow us on social media, and also become a supporter. Donate if you can. We are a reader, listener, viewer-funded outlet. It keeps us independent, keeps us to be able to say the things that we need to say when it comes to Venezuela and the US-Venezuela relationship. So before I go, Ricardo, some final words did you want to say before we say goodbye for today?
Yeah, just echo what you said. Stay in touch, follow our content, because we are tackling everything on different formats, trying to reach the audience as best we can. And, we started the day thinking, maybe we don't have so much to talk about it, but, as we get into it, there's always a lot to unpack. So yeah, the recommendation is to follow Venezuelanalysis and most importantly, organize and resist.
That's right. We've seen a lot of resistance in the United States. Keep it up. It's important. Know that the peoples of Latin America are also watching and cheering you on. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Venezuelan Analysis podcast, and we'll see you next time.